Thank you very much. So yes, I'm Nolwenn Maudet, and I'm going to present our work Beyond Grids, Interactive Graphical Substrates to Structure Digital Layout that I've conducted with Ghita Jalal, Tchernavskij, Michel Beaudouin-Lafon, Wendy, Mackay. So first, graphic designers, they traditionally use grid to structure their layout. You can see an example here of a grid that is used to structure the content, but that might not be visible in the end. However, today we have new media and format variety that has new constraints and opportunities. So what we mean by that is that whereas before designers were having like for the page dimension on which then to construct their layout, now they need to cope with the various device sizes. And similarly, before they used to have the content beforehand, but right now when they are designing, for example, a blog layout, they might not know what will be the content. So this leads to new opportunities. So how can we better support these new graphic design practices? So first, let's look at how the SIGCHI literature has dealt with it. And one very common way of dealing with layout is proposing automatic layout tools. However, they're mostly designed for novice users and might not support the needs of extreme users. Another very typical way of supporting their work is to provide tools for supporting microtasks such as alignment and distribution that are really key, but they don't support tools for the generation of structuring the layout. And another type of tools that we can see these days, but they're mostly outside of research actually, are programming tools, but they require designers to shift their way of thinking into programming that might not be better suited to how they usually interact. So first, we were wondering, how do graphic designers structure their layouts today? So to answer this question, we conducted 12 interviews with graphic designers. So we went to their offices and we asked them to show us very recent projects on which they had been structuring layout. And we asked them to show us all the different steps in the process that they had and all of the different artifacts that they used. So we collected a lot of data in the form of notes, photographed, video, and audio. And we summarized this data in the form of what we call story portraits. So you can see here an example. We have, every time we have a picture of the final artifact, and we illustrate all the different steps in the process, along with quotes from the participant. So we created 52 of those story portraits that capture the diverse layout creation practices from our expert users. And what we could see is that whereas, yes, graphic designers, they sometimes use grid to structure their layout, as you can see here. But what we found is that they often go beyond, and I'm going to give you an example. So in this story, this designer used a grid, but she used an overall principle. She said, I want to design my layout entirely based on the number 42. So she used that number for every aspect of her layout. So for example, all the colors were multiple of the number 42, the font sizes as well, the grid dimensions, and also the line widths, for example. So what we found is that those designers, they always create what they call rules, relationship, principles, constraints, architectures, and we call those principles graphical substrates. Why graphical substrates? We were inspired by the biological terms of substrates. It's like the soil on which the plants can grow and evolve, and we think that graphic designers, they create the same kind of substrate on which their layout can evolve and that might not be visible in the end. And those graphical substrates are mapping inputs that are of 3 different categories. So they map conceptual inputs, content inputs, and contextual inputs into spatial outputs and temporal outputs. And I'm going to give an example for each of those categories. So let's dive in the inputs. So first, conceptual inputs. We saw an example of the number 42. That's a clear concept. I'm going to use the number 42 to design my layout, but here is another example in which the designer decided to create what she called an abstract landscape. So she has a leaflet on which she has all the text printed, and what she does is she removes all the letters except for the letter C, and that creates what she called an abstract landscape. In terms of creating graphical substrate based on content parameters, In this story, this designer wanted to see how she could structure a layout without using the traditional way of structuring. So she set herself a constraint. She said, I'm going to use only Helvetica and only in 12 points. So no bold, no italic, no changing the font size. So what she did instead is she focused on a different type of content, and she said, for each title, I will repeat it 5 times, and I will also repeat 3 times each subtitles. And this is the way she structured a layout, and this creates what she calls visual masses. And the last way of structuring the layout was using contextual inputs. So this can be, for example, the page dimension that is really critical to structure your layout. But in this context, in this story, this designer used the binding of the book, the architectural binding, and what she did is she printed out the picture on the whole spread, and thus she would have actually a confrontation between 2 different images. And that's the way she structured a layout. Then, when graphic designers were having these inputs, they used their graphical substrate to lay out this into spatial outputs. So in this story, this designer wanted to lay out a lot of different project cards, and there were too many to fit on only one screen, so she had to overimpose them. So what she did is she divided her screen into many different frames according to the country of origin of each project. But beyond laying out content in space, designers also laid out in a temporal aspect. So in this story, this designer is creating a series of posters that evolve over time, but he wants to keep the unicity. He wants people to know that they are part of the same series. So what he does is he has several elements, and some elements are never going to change, such as the backbone. So he has this long straight line that is never going to change. But then he has other elements, such as the planet on the top right corner, that is slightly evolving over time for each new edition of the poster. So what we found is that although graphic designers are creating a lot of graphical substrates, traditional layout tools offer very limited support for those graphical substrates. So for example, in a story with the number 42, if the designer changes her mind and decided to use the number 50, she has to go and manually edit all of the different features in design. But what we also found is that designers who are currently using code, and you can see their stories there, what they managed to do is they managed to reify those graphical substrates. So what we mean by reify is they turn those ideas that they have in their mind into an object that then they can interact with. So we want to adapt this. So we want to create tools that are supporting the reification of graphical substrates. So what we did first is we created 2 probes inspired directly by the design practices. And then we tried them with 12 graphic designers, and we were mostly interested in how they would appropriate those tools in the context of their own work. And what I have to say also is because those were probes, they had extremely limited set of functionalities because we were interested more into how designers would appropriate them. So the first probe is called Contextify, and it's about letting users tailor the layout according to readers' goals and context. And we were especially inspired by this story, in which this designer created a layout using CSS print. And what she does is then she says to each reader, you have to print the book yourself. So the reader has to go on Chrome and press the print button, and then they have to actually choose the page dimension. And so each reader is going to have a completely different book with a completely different layout. So the reader is fully integrated in the creation of the layout itself. So we created Contextify based on this idea of integrating the reader in the creation of the layout. And we were also inspired from some other stories to be able to take as parameters environmental parameters. So here we use the idea of either using day or night parameters. So here you can set up you can choose your different parameters on the left. So let's see how it works. In this story, this designer is creating a detailed sub layout, laying out all the content in space, including the images and the title. And then the designer is selecting the other option, creating the summary sub layout. So he's removing some of the text, putting the bigger fonts, Then they create the day and night sublayouts, playing on the various colors. And what Contextify does is that it's combining the sublayouts to meet the needs of the reader and on the environment parameters. And so when we tried this probe with the designer, she's actually designing textbooks for students on iPads. And what she said is that she could create her own parameters to have different layouts depending on whether the student is at home or if the student is in the class. So in the class, they would have only images and the text, but whenever the student gets at home, she would enable, for example, the display of videos or sound files. The second probe is called Linkify, and it creates dynamic relationships among content properties. It's based on this story. So this designer was creating a blog layout, and he created a script to map the creation of the custom crest behind the title. It will be generated using the length of the title. So the number of characters in the title will generate the crest behind. So in Linkify, we reuse the same ideas. So we propose for each content element, you will have 5 different parameters that you can link with other elements. So here, the designer is creating a link between the position of the element. So whenever you move, it moves the other one. And this link is actually applied to the other articles. In this story, the designer created a link between the number of characters and the size of the image. And in this last story, the designer is creating many relationships between the images and the number of characters in the title, and this gets applied automatically. So when we tried Linkify, one designer is actually creating a blog in which he's posting a new article every week. And what he says is that he would like to be creating, using Linkify, creating a new layout every week. And this would actually transform the layout of all of the past week examples. So he said that would provide a new reading experience for people who are returning. Based on those findings that we got from the designers, we created StyleBlocks that fully reifies graphical substrates into interactive structures using CSS properties. And the idea is that designer can directly extract the content, so it works bottom-up and also top-down. What we mean by bottom-up is here the designer is extracting the feature and then extracting the number from the title, and then applying this number to the position of the other images. And those relationships can be customized. That was something that the designer really wanted from the probe. So designers can create a ratio, for example, and they can apply this ratio to one of the relationships. As shown here, so they move differently. And then the designer can actually extract the position. She wants the position of the right image to be the extreme right so that the images wouldn't go beyond. So here she's extracting that feature and then she's adding this number directly in the relationship. So it really goes both ways, bottom up and top down. So what we've shown is that designers really go beyond grids. What they create instead is what we call graphical substrates that are mapping inputs that they found in concept, content, and context, and they use them to create spatial and temporal outputs. Based on this, we created Linkify and Contextify, 2 probes that partially reified graphical substrates, and we tried them with 12 graphic designers. Based on their insights, we created a full-fledged prototype called StyleBlocks that transforms graphical substrates into interactive features that using CSS. But what we want to say beyond that is that we think this opens really a new area for people to create interactive graphical substrate that will help designers structure digital layout far beyond what they can do today. And with this, I will conclude my talk. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Joe. I work at the New York Times in advertising, and one of the things I do every day is work with my designers and try to enable, more expressiveness for them on the web. So lovely talk. Thank you. I want to ask you if you have any ideas on how these substrates might benefit things like responsive design. Because that's a very big challenge, and especially when the target display environment is different than the environment in which the designer is crafting their design intent.
Exactly. We think that's actually one of the potential uses of graphical substrate. We want to be able to go beyond what we currently call responsive design, because currently we can just play actually with the device sizes, but we think we could go far beyond into integrating other possibilities and having readers actually really interact with the layout. So yeah, and I think having this also can help designers prototype at different scales and having the same content reflected on different environment directly. Yeah.
In addition, I want to thank you for sort of performing the ethnography and understanding how designers are creating these. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ali Jahanian from MIT. It's a great talk and great work. Thank you. Yes, this is true that designers often create grids and sometimes break the grids for different reasons. And in fact, there are some books about that. And I'm very happy that you could make it to such an excellent work. The question is, for these two specific applications or probes that you showed, what is the cost function? Or what are you optimizing for? Is it aesthetics, or is it communicating or conveying the message, or is it just to make that aha moment that designers sometimes want to create?
So I think, I didn't have time to really talk about that in his talk, and we propose more in the paper, but what we found is that when designers were using programming, they could, for example, have automation. What they cannot have today, let's say in design, for example, like when they are creating their substrate using code, they can really quickly change their mind, and it will be automatically reapplied, so they don't need to manually change everything. So that would be one benefit of working with graphical substrate. Like really reifying something means that you can easily interact with it, and it's really easy to then tweak something. And I got lost. I had something else to say. And another thing is also really something that we found is that they wanted to integrate more readers, and they cannot really do that in current tools. So we think that graphical substrate could be one way of integrating more parameters in their work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is David. I'm from the University of Calgary. This is really cool. I love it.
Thank you.
So I'm a self-proclaimed graphic design nerd, and one question that I have is, it feels like with some of the tools that you made,
on recently is called sticky lines, and it's more actually reifying the grid itself, so you can manipulate elements. So I've been doing work on this other area, but it's true that here the metaphor was more on the link, but we could expand this. That's only one possible metaphor, and we could do more, definitely.
That sounds awesome. I'm looking forward to that.
Thank
Thanks.
you.